So we're talking today about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in terms of the International Criminal Court. And the big question is the International Criminal Court prosecutor, whose name is Fatou Bensouda, is she going to dive deeper into it? Is this the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, when there's a war, when there are settlements being built, is all of that suddenly going to find its way into a courtroom in The Hague? And I should start off by saying the only journalist in the Israeli media who has done a one-on-one interview with Bensouda last year, and also one of the only journalists who interviewed Fakiso Mochochoko also last year when he's the head of the jurisdiction department for the International Criminal Court when he visited Israel and the West Bank. And I'm going to share, sort of my understanding of what is likely to happen. Mostly, I'm going to focus on sort of how Israel understands these issues. One, because that's what I write about the most. Two, because the fact is that Israel has a little bit, from being the more powerful party, let's say in the area, has a little bit of a potential, veto about whether it cooperates or not with the International Criminal Court. I will, at certain points, try to also sort of highlight how the Palestinians view things. I'm not representing, part of my resume in the past was I had various Israeli government positions. I'm not representing the Israeli government in any way, shape, or form. There's some things that they do that I think are good. There's some things that, on my personal views I might not agree with. So you don't need to ask me, what do I think about, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu did X. I don't have to defend that because I'm a journalist. So let's start with, I'm really going to summarize two major views about Israel, how Israel views the International Criminal Court. One of them I would call, and this is like a sort of traditional Israeli viewpoint, is the world is out to get us. And we'll go into a little bit more depth about this, but there's an Israeli viewpoint, you can agree or disagree with it, that a lot of international organizations in the United Nations system, the International Criminal Court is not part of the United Nations system directly, but a lot of international organizations are usually biased against Israel. There's a general viewpoint that a lot of Israelis have. And the other viewpoint that I would say is that by Israel cooperating and providing lots of information to the International Criminal Court, that the ICC is not going to get deeper into the conflict because they'll say, you know what, the Israeli army is investigating its own alleged war crimes. The most noteworthy one is he's known as the Hebron shooter, who shot a Palestinian attacker who had stabbed a couple of Israeli soldiers, but he'd also been shot. He was lying on the ground. A lot of people might have seen this video about a year and a half ago. An Israeli soldier came up 10 minutes later and shot this Palestinian, dead while he was lying on the ground. So that Israeli soldier is in prison right now on a 14-month prison term. So the second school from the Israeli viewpoint is we will demonstrate to the International Criminal Court we investigate our own alleged war crimes, and so they'll stay out of it. I'll give you sort of a little bit of a critique on both of them first, but before we jump deeper into that, one time I gave this lecture and about 20 minutes in, somebody said, what's the International Criminal Court? So does anybody know, first of all, what the difference is between the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice?
No. I think you should explain it.
You can raise it. Yes, go for it.
Yeah, International Court of Justice looks at cases between nations. International Criminal Court indicts, individuals for very large crimes against humanity.
Right, so that's a big piece, and then the other piece is civil and criminal, right? The International Court of Justice handles civil cases, let's say about water rights, and the International Criminal Court handles war crimes, criminal cases against individuals versus against countries. So one of the first things, by the way, you should watch whenever you see journalists write about war crimes, everybody mixes up and throws in the International Court of Justice because that's what's been around since basically the founding of the UN, whereas the International Criminal Court has only been around since 2002. So people still get confused between the two. So you can keep an eye on that in articles when you're grading journalists on how up they are on the legal stuff. Yeah, so that's the International Criminal Court. Basically, there was a statute called the Rome Statute passed in 1998. These things take a while to go into effect, so the court actually started to operate in 2002. Most of what it has done since then is war crimes prosecutions related to Africa. There's a whole debate about whether that's on purpose, that it's too focused on Africa and sort of discriminating against Africans, or just unfortunately that's where a lot of the bigger genocides and wars are happening these days. But it does have what's called a preliminary investigation into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It does have investigations related to Russia and Georgia fighting a war in 2008. Has some things having to do with various things that the United States or England have done in the Middle East. So it doesn't just focus on Africa, but the big cases that have moved forward and where people have been convicted have mostly been about Africa. That's to date. And that's one of the reasons there is so much attention on what so far is just, again, called a preliminary examination. So this is January 2015 was when the Palestinian Authority declared that it wanted to join the International Criminal Court as the State of Palestine. Rewinding a little bit, the UN General Assembly accepted a State of Palestine with around 135 countries out of 190 in favor in 2012. Hasn't been accepted as a full member state, right? It's the UN Security Council is like the final body on that, so it's sort of a non-member state, something like something in between status, but it was enough of a status that the International Criminal Court prosecutor said, for our purposes, you are a state. There is a State of Palestine. You can send us war crimes complaints. And basically, the idea of a preliminary examination, if you sort of take it down from its international place and just take like a regular crime, right? The police start to examine something. They start to investigate. And then after they compile their case, they send it over to a district attorney, a U.S. attorney. So that's what a preliminary examination is, sort of like where the police are examining all of the evidence to decide whether to recommend, that there be, a case. And the big question is, will this become a full criminal examination, which could eventually become, indictments against Israeli soldiers, Israeli officials, Palestinian soldiers or militants. So that's the big question that's on the table. Most of what we're talking about, then there's a whole debate, I'll get into this a little bit, there's a whole debate about whether the International Criminal Court prosecutors should have accepted a State of Palestine, again, because Palestine has not been accepted as a full member state at the UN. That's a big criticism from the Israeli side. We'll get into that a little bit more in a second. But the two big things that the International Criminal Court, the ICC, is going to be dealing with is the 2014 Gaza war and the settlement enterprise. We're going to talk more about the 2014 Gaza war because there's a lot more information about it. It's a lot more sort of able, you can debate the facts a lot more. The settlement enterprise, the whole idea of prosecuting, settlements, people for living in a place as opposed to, genocide or war crimes and fighting is a novel idea. Nobody's done it yet. It's a little bit harder to talk about, what that might look like. The 2014 Gaza war, just a little review, because it's been a couple of years. Basically, Hamas fires thousands of rockets on Israel. Israel does thousands of airstrikes on Gaza. More than 70 Israelis were killed. Several 100,000 Israelis had to evacuate their homes. Something that gets left out of this when we talk about basically 70 Israelis were killed, 2,100, 2,200 Palestinians were killed. So people will say, well, obviously Israel must have committed war crimes because look at how many Palestinians were killed and how many fewer Israelis were killed. Could get into this deeper, but hundreds of thousands of Israelis had to evacuate their homes. It wasn't, the fact that only, so to speak, 70 Israelis were killed was not a small thing in terms of how it felt in Israel in terms of the impact on the country. There's a debate, ongoing debate about the number of Palestinians who were killed, what percentage of them were civilians. The Palestinian side said it might have been as high as 80%. Israeli intelligence said it might have been as high as 45%. That's an important statistic because when you look at, let's say, US and coalition airstrikes in Syria and Iraq, unfortunately, you'll find that there is, once you get to a certain amount of activity, civilians do get caught up in things. So whether the percentages, or this percentage or that percentage does make a big difference. And I'm sure, if anything went forward, there'd be a big debate about, people, whether whether somebody was a combatant or a civilian, which would be very complicated in Gaza because we know that Hamas, which is the group, the fundamentalist religious group that runs Gaza, doesn't, wear uniforms will sort of blend in with the civilian population, so it might not always be easy to know whether somebody is a combatant or a civilian. The settlements, I'm just going to say one quick word about it. The settlements are in dispute, right? This is the West Bank, whether Jews are allowed to have built in the West Bank since the 1967 war or not. It's, under UN Resolution 242, basically the idea is the status of the West Bank is supposed to be resolved in negotiations between all of the different parties. And so it's hard to say exactly, what the status are. More of the world, definitely, more of the world believes that the settlements are illegal. The United States, it sort of depends who's president. Sometimes the president says they're okay. Sometimes they say they're illegitimate but not illegal. One or two presidents have said they were illegal, so it sort of depends. The United States takes different positions. Nobody has said to this date that they are a war crime. Okay, you can have violation of, an airplane can fly into somebody else's territory, and that can be a violation of that country's sovereignty, can be a violation of international law. That doesn't mean it's a war crime. A war crime is supposed to be conventionally understood to be genocide, crimes against humanity, hundreds of thousands of people being killed or raped, something like that. So we haven't seen until now, and it's not that Israel is the only country that has settled in an area that was disputed. There are other examples in Cyprus, in Ukraine. There's, I think, at least 5 modern examples that are ongoing, and none of those countries, at least to date, have been taken the idea of living in a place is a war crime as opposed to just a violation of international law. One thing to note about this also is if the International Criminal Court dives into this, it's not going to be the entire settlement enterprise going back to 1967. It would be at earliest from November 29th, 2012, because that's when Palestine became recognized by the UN General Assembly as a state. Or more likely, it would be since June 2014, because that's when the Palestinian Authority applied, so to speak, for when the International Criminal Court should start looking at things as of June 2014. So we're talking about probably a fraction of the settlement enterprise, if, again, it was looked at as a war crime, which we call it in, the legal profession, an issue of first impression, so to speak. If they decided it was a war crime, where we'd be talking about a very small percentage of the settlements that are actually there is what the International Criminal Court would be looking at. So when I said at the beginning, we're talking about 2 different Israeli schools of how they view what's going to happen, what are the predictions, what the International Criminal Court will do, right? This first school was this, the world is out to get us, and the second school, we'll be able to convince them not to go after us. So view number 1. So the view number 1 says the world is out to get us. There's no reason to cooperate with the ICC. The ICC is like, let's say, UNESCO, which has made several decisions that sites which have value both to the Jewish people in Israel and to the Palestinians and to the Muslim world, such as the Temple Mount, such as Hebron. They've made a number of decisions where they leaned heavily towards sort of Palestinian heritage and against Jewish heritage. The UN Human Rights Council, which has something called Agenda Item 7, in which they basically, every single time they meet, especially criticize Israel, have more votes against Israel than they do about countries like North Korea and other countries that have done things that are a lot worse and are considered rogue regimes. So that's where that school of thought is coming from. There are all these UN groups that are against us, and the ICC is, a kangaroo court. Lump them in with those other groups. There's no reason to cooperate with them. That's what this school of thought would say, and it would say we can beat the ICC. Again, this is not my view. I'm just explaining Israeli views. We can beat the ICC diplomatically. A case in point is South Africa. The Sudanese president Omar al-Bashir was in South Africa. South Africa is a member of the International Criminal Court. One quick aside, Israel hasn't signed on to the International Criminal Court. So all of this, there's sort of this theoretical idea of Israel wants to cooperate because Israel says it's very committed to international law. But theoretically, it's unclear whether the International Criminal Court could proceed against Israel because Israel isn't even a member of the statute. Put that on the side for a second, because Israel doesn't want the International Criminal Court to be going after it, whether it's a member or not. So in terms of South Africa, so the president of Sudan, pretty much all Western countries would say consider him a war criminal for genocide that's been committed in Sudan, and South Africa said he basically there's an ICC warrant for his arrest, and they didn't turn him over. They let him visit South Africa and leave. By the way, even the South African Supreme Court criticized the South African executive for not turning him over to the ICC, but that's what happens. Israel said, look, we're not even a member, so if South Africa was able to ignore the ICC, in that instance, we cannot ignore the ICC also. All of this might have looked a little bit different if there was a Hillary Clinton presidency right now, because under Barack Obama and probably under Hillary Clinton presidency, there was the United States is also not a member of the ICC, but there was an idea of the United States trying to support the ICC from the outside. And a Donald Trump presidency, Donald Trump is not, interested very much in international organizations, doesn't have very high thinking of international organizations, certainly is not supporting the ICC about going after Israel. So basically, all of this, would be this whole viewpoint from some Israelis don't cooperate with the ICC. I would say this is a big mistake. Having met Bensouda, having met Fakizo Mochochoko and a number of the other officials, I think if you look at the ICC's record, trying to lump it in with some of the other organizations is a big mistake, and it doesn't fit. I'll give some examples of why. There have been a number of examples where the ICC could have gone after Israel, and it chose not to. I think the biggest example so far, late July 2015, Bensouda, basically, this is the ICC prosecutor. So does anybody know what the Mavi Marmara flotilla of 2010 was? Go for it.
It was a big deal. There was a humanitarian aid ship sent from Turkey. It wants to go directly to Gaza. Then Israel Navy intervened. Technically, they intervened in international waters, although it was clearly heading towards Gaza. And but of course, Gaza's waters are controlled by Israel. Anyway, because it was the intervention was in international waters, and I think there were some deaths, definitely some casualties.
Yeah, there were 10 Turkish people were killed.
Yeah, one of them had American citizenship. Didn't really matter much. So because it was on international waters, there was a talk of making a case against Israel.
Right. Okay. So so the Turkish side said Israel violated international law. It killed people who were bringing humanitarian aid. Israel said the other boats only had people who were bringing humanitarian aid, but the specific boat where there was fighting, because there were several boats, and all of the boats except for one were commandeered by Israel without any altercation. The one boat where there was an altercation, Israel said that when its troops came on, they were attacked with pipes and other kinds of sort of makeshift weapons. Several Israeli soldiers were actually, wounded and hurt, and there was actually a fight between the soldiers, and some of the people on that boat were considered members of an organization called the IHH, which there's a debate about, whether that's maybe a militant organization, and you can come at this from different. There have been different UN reports about it. Some said both sides, weren't perfect, but it's, not exactly clear what happened. Some said, Israel was wrong. Some said, Israel was okay. There have been a lot of different reports about it. Basically, this all came before the ICC, and the ICC prosecutor said, I'm not going to, I did a preliminary examination. I'm not going to do a full criminal investigation. And the reason she cited was, she said, without getting into who was right or who was wrong, 10 people died. As the International Criminal Court, we deal with war crimes of great gravity where large numbers of people die. We can't investigate every incident where only 10 people died. I mean, every life is valuable, but basically she was saying there are other organizations or courts that should do that. We focus on major, large numbers of people being killed. The International Criminal Court said that's not good enough. We don't agree with you. We want you to fully criminally investigate it. But that's the lower court, the ICC pretrial chamber. She appealed the pretrial chamber to the ICC supreme body, the ICC appeals court, basically doubling down, saying I'm not criminally investigating this. And the ICC Appeals Court basically said to her, take a look at it one more time, but if you decide not to do a full criminal investigation, that's okay as long as you take a look at it one more time. If she was out to get Israel, she would have used the cover of the ICC pretrial chamber ordering her to get deeper into this idea of war crimes in that incident. She would have used that to get into it. And the fact that she didn't, she appealed against it and has basically stuck to her guns and said she's staying out of it, is at least one example where she doesn't, she wouldn't fall easily into this category of out to get Israel the way that some UN organizations might. Just from my interview with her, she made it very clear to me that while she did take basically direction from the UN General Assembly about accepting Palestine as a state, she said that's it. She said if the UN General Assembly, the UN Human Rights Council from this point on tries to order me how I do my investigation, to do more investigating, to try to bring war crimes cases, if I don't think I find it, I'm going to ignore them. The only thing that they could give me direction about is whether Palestine was a state or not. That was a very big deal because one of the things that, again, Israelis who think the world is, the international community is biased, said was, well, she recognized the state of Palestine. That shows that she's biased because Israel says there is no state of Palestine. Palestine doesn't have set borders. Fatah, one group of Palestinians runs the West Bank. Hamas, a different group of the Palestinians runs Gaza, so it's not even one state. And it hasn't been recognized by the UN Security Council. A whole lot of arguments you could make about whether or not Palestine is a state or not. So the fact she accepted Palestine as a state was sort of held against her. But here she was saying, I'm ready to ignore UN organizations that tell me to go after Israel at this point forward. And there was a case in point. The UN Human Rights Council issued a major report in 2014 basically saying very clearly, we do think that Israel deliberately committed war crimes in the 2014 Gaza war. And here we are in November 2017, and she hasn't decided yet. If she was rushing to go after Israel, there wouldn't have been 3 years passing since the UN Human Rights Council basically said, this is what we think. So clearly she wasn't willing to just go with the UN Human Rights Council. And this idea of time in general, and it was something that she said to me which was astonishing at the time. I was the first person to report it. I said to her, how long do you think it's going to take you to decide? 3 months, 5 months, a year? And she said, I don't want to commit to time periods. So then as somebody, I've done some prosecuting, I've interrogated people, in depositions. So then you sort of throw out longer time periods until you can get somebody, to commit to something. I said, how about 3 years? How about 5 years? And no prosecutor is going to say, oh, I'm going to take more than 5 years to decide on a case, because that makes them look like they're just twiddling their thumbs and not doing something real. And she said, I'm not committing to any time period. And that blew me away. It blew a lot of people away because basically you have some examples. I think the longest one is Colombia, South America. The ICC investigated for 11 years before they made a decision. I think the Russia-Georgia case, maybe it's 7 or 8 years. So we could be looking at that long a time frame. And if that's true, then what we might be talking about, what Bensouda did, is maybe just sort of starting this case along. And she may not even decide in her 9-year term whether to fully and criminally investigate, whether to indict. She may leave that to the next person, the next ICC prosecutor, or maybe she'll make a decision towards the end of her term, but really the issue will be handled by the next ICC prosecutor. And this, by the way, Israel is thrilled about this time, because the more time passes, the less sort of the whole issue is hot for the international community. And the Palestinians are furious about this. They, every couple months they, say, how can the ICC not have decided whether it's going to, criminally investigate a war that happened over 3 years ago? So those are examples for why I think, from the Israeli perspective, it's rushing to judgment to say that the ICC is like some of these other UN organizations that Israelis feel are biased against them. Another very important issue, and I sort of hinted to this before, but there's a concept called complementarity. So I said that there's this second school of thought in Israel that says we should absolutely cooperate with the ICC. We should give them all the information they need, because we do trust them that if we give them all the information they need, they'll see that we did 500 examinations of alleged war crimes, 30 full criminal investigations of our own soldiers. They'll see that we already convicted and sent to jail the Hebron shooter, and that there might be other indictments and convictions. And from that, they'll say, okay, we will choose not to intervene. Why is this important? Because complementarity means that the ICC is only allowed to intervene if a country does not prosecute on its own. Okay, if a country prosecutes on its own, investigates on its own soldiers for alleged war crimes, the ICC is not allowed to intervene. Now you could have a debate about whether, you could say that a country is going through the motions, sort of doing, fake investigating to, sort of try to get the ICC off its back. And that would be, by the way, that's something that hasn't come up yet. Basically, usually because it's been sort of the ICC dealing with countries in Africa that are usually very clear that, we killed these other people and we're not ashamed about it, and we're not investigating it. This is really the first time that we've had a major dialogue between a democratic country that actually has a rule of law, that actually has a prosecution, where there might be this discussion about what should the lines be for, how much investigating is sufficient investigating? How much time should it take? Is there a certain number of indictments that need to be had if a certain number of people died? Or do you look at, each individual case by itself? So this is a big reason that people, the second school of thought says cooperate with the ICC, because the ICC, if we show them all of the details, then they'll see that really Israel did investigate things very carefully. The big quote that I tell people from this, the former top lawyer for the Israeli army, Danny Efroni, said, "It is hard for me to see how the prosecutor could explain a decision to open a full criminal investigation due to lacking in the Israeli army's investigating because it's done so many investigations. Now, I think this is also a little bit of a mistake. Having spent some time with Bensouda and her staff, this is sort of assuming not just, let's say, that Israel will present its side of the case and that side will be convincing, but it's also assuming that there's sort of this elephant in the room of that if the ICC would go after Israel, would bring down a lot of anger from the United States and maybe some of Israel's European allies. Maybe some of them would even withdraw donations. And there's an assumption that Bensouda has a sort of political bone in her, that she would be concerned about the political implications of investigating Israel. And I don't think she does. What she has shown is that she was willing to go after Russia in terms of the Russia-Georgia war from 2008. And that was a very, you could call it bold, authentic, or foolhardy, depending on your sort of understanding of politics and diplomacy. But it was a big deal to go after a country like Russia when the ICC is still sort of just trying to get its, shoes. I mean, the fact that it's from 2002, that's a really young international organization. It's still an organization that really does need to worry about, is it going to be taken seriously by the world? The Kenya investigation, right? There was two sides killing each other. There's some problems right now in Kenya, but the last time there was a Kenyan election, the two sides really went after each other, and there were genocide allegations from both directions. And what she could have done is gone after some Kenyans, but not the two top leaders in Kenya who were running the show during that war. And if she had sort of left them alone and just gone after their lieutenants, people would have said that's a smart political move. She's doing some justice, enough justice, but not going after, the top two political leaders who are, the president and I think the other, his rival, I think was the vice president or some other top position, because if you go after them, they're not going to cooperate. But she went after them, and where Kenya had been cooperating with the ICC until she went after them, as soon as she went after them, Kenya stopped cooperating, the case fell apart. And some people would say, that's, somebody who's going to follow, let's say, her moral, voice, regardless of how the politics and diplomacy pan out. So that's something that I would say for people who think that she, simply by sharing information and by, let's say, this veiled diplomatic threat, if she goes after Israel, she could face losing donations or, diplomatic offensive. I don't think she cares about those things. Some, specific individual issues that have come up that I have a little bit of a concern about. So, for example, I talked to her about the fact that you can say Israel's investigations aren't good enough. You could say they're too slow. You could say they're just for show. Hamas has done no investigating. Okay, you have on one side a country which either its investigations are serious and good, or they're insufficient, but there is investigating. There are soldiers who have been indicted. There's at least one who's gone to jail. There have been a number of criminal investigations. A number of soldiers have been questioned to the point that Israeli generals have been very angry with the head of the Israeli legal division for questioning senior officers, and there have been political fights about that in Israel, and the Israeli legal division has continued on that. But let's say you could say it's a debate whether Israel's investigations are good enough or not, and Hamas has done zero investigating. So I said to her, what if you say Israel's investigations are insufficient and Hamas has done zero? Does that mean you would only go after Israelis? How would that be justice? How would that be equal? And she didn't exactly answer the question, but it seemed to me that that was one possibility that they would consider, which for me, and I guess we're all biased, but if I try to make myself a neutral observer, it would seem to me that you have to either go after both sides or not go after both sides, that has to be part of the game. We also talked about Hamas's fighting techniques, right? It's been, and this has been reported. There were at least 7 journalists in Gaza during the 2014 Gaza war who bravely, some of them tweeted out before they got arrested by Hamas that Hamas was firing rockets from civilian areas. There are 7 examples where Hamas hid rockets in UN facilities that are supposed to be just used for helping the Gazan public. Is that there is this extra challenge, and it's not just Hamas, where we've seen that it's happened in Libya and Syria and Iraq, that there are some groups that use asymmetrical warfare, human shields, fighting among civilians as a way to try to shield themselves. They'll say that it's the only way that they can fight back because Israel is a superior power, but the fact is it's not allowed under international law. That in itself is considered a war crime. And when I said to when you look at that as unique, by the way, there's actually, during the 2014 Gaza war, there was a Hamas manual that was captured that gave exact descriptions about exactly how and why to use civilians as basically as human shields, so that A, it would be less likely you'd be attacked by the Israeli army, and B, if they attacked you, at least it would give a public relations advantage. It would delegitimize the Israeli army. This manual has been widely produced and handed out. It was one of my highest hit articles online of all time. And when I mentioned it to her, I said, will you look at the entire situation differently because of the difficulties that Israel was facing in terms of dealing with that asymmetric challenge? And I did not get a clear answer about that. So that's, again, something that I would be concerned not as a journalist who just covers Israel, but if I was a journalist who was covering the United States or the coalition in Syria and Iraq, I do not believe that just because somebody uses human shields or fights among civilians, that means that you can just kill all the civilians you want. You have to follow the principles of distinction, proportionality, necessity. But I do think that if we're going to be honest, that fighting in those conditions is more difficult, and it makes it more likely that civilian casualties are going to happen in some higher number, no matter how hard you work to try to keep those down. And I think that's been proven to happen with a lot of countries in Syria and Iraq. Certainly the Saudis, with their fighting in Yemen, their percentages with civilians are definitely worse. Russia's percentages with hurting civilians are definitely worse. Neither of those countries are democracies. You could put them on the side, but what's going on with Syria and Iraq, people are seeing high numbers of civilians getting caught up, even with countries that are not Israel, that are democratic countries that you would think would want to avoid civilian casualties. So I wanted to make 1 or 2 more comments. When do I think she's actually going to decide? I think it's going to take some more time. For one thing, I think she's waiting for Israel to issue a report about the 3 biggest quote-unquote incidents of the war. One of them is known in Israel as Black Friday, when somewhere between 40 to 100 Palestinian civilians were killed all in one incident. One is known as occurred in Shijaya, and one occurred in Kuza. these are the 3 incidents where the largest number of Palestinian civilians died in a particular period in a particular place. And Israel has not issued its full report on. It's issued 5 reports on a number of other incidents, but it hasn't issued its full report on this. I think she's waiting for that report to come out, and I think the Israeli army is waiting to issue its report until this other organization in Israel called the State Comptroller issues a parallel report about it. So everybody's waiting on somebody else's report. So I think the State Comptroller's report is probably going to come out. They told me it was going to come out last year, but when I spoke to them a couple months ago, they said it's going to come out, by the early winter months. So I think hopefully it will come out in the next couple months. Then you'll see the Israeli army issue a report, and then we might have a time frame for when the ICC might make its decisions about some of these things. One comment just about how complex this all is. I wanted to talk about the whole Black Friday incident, which is, people say, look, if there were 100, Palestinians were killed, there's debate whether there were 40 Palestinian civilians or 100 Palestinian civilians, but even 40 is a very large number in a small period of time. How can there not have been war crimes, accomplished, and why hasn't Israel issued a report already? And when I talk off the record with top Israeli officials, what they say to me is, it wasn't one incident. It was 100 separate incidents. They may all have happened in a very short period of time, but there was basically fighting back and forth between Israeli armed forces and Hamas in several different places. You can't analyze the intent of one person, 3 miles this way and somebody 2 miles that way that are fighting different people. You have to analyze each of them having, sort of a separate intent. And each case is separate, and it ends up breaking down into 100 incidents. So it's not simple. That's their explanation anyway as to why 3 years later they haven't issued a full report. They're saying if it was one incident, we would have issued a report by now. But when we're analyzing 100 incidents dealing with dozens and dozens of soldiers, it's a lot more complicated. My bottom line is I think a diplomatic showdown between the ICC and Israel and the Palestinians is not a foregone conclusion. I also don't think that the ICC is just going to take a pass here. I think it's too big an issue, and I think the criticism that has come out that the ICC is just focused on Africa has taken a toll on Bensouda, even if she doesn't care about politics. I think it is something that they're sensitive to. And I think what you'll likely see is some sort of a game of chicken, at least between the ICC and Israel, where the ICC will say, these cases you did okay. These cases, we think you should do some more investigating, and then you might see some negotiating back and forth between Israel and the ICC on those particular cases. I think neither side wants a blow up. I think both sides want, so you might see Israel be willing to do a second round of investigating in some of these cases, say yes here, no there, and then both the sides sort of feel out each other to try to create a situation where the ICC feels like it has had an impact in the Israeli justice system without having a complete diplomatic fallout. I don't think Hamas is going to investigate at all, and that will be another question. I have no idea how the ICC will handle it. If there is a blow-up with Israel, if they can negotiate with Israel, sort of some in-between ground on the investigations, then maybe at the end of the day it doesn't matter as much for Israel what Hamas does. If there's a blow-up, then I don't know what they're going to do, because Hamas is going to do no investigating, I think. There hasn't been, anything to date. And then the ICC would have to decide, are they going to just go after one side when the other side has done nothing? I wanted to make one quick mentioning. This is not necessarily 100% related to all of this, but we are talking about international law. And tomorrow is the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, which you can have an endless debate between Israelis and Palestinians about who has the right to the land from 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, who was there for longer, who had more sovereignty. But let's say the first modern legal argument that Israel has been able to make in terms of its international rights are from 1917, when Lord Balfour of England said that the British government's policy would be to establish in Palestine a national home for the Jewish people. By the way, they also made some side promises to the Arab sides at the time. But when we're in an age where people sometimes are not just talking about, did Israel commit a war crime in this place or that place, but some people are saying, does Israel have any legitimacy at all? Should it even exist? The Balfour Declaration was the first legal document that ended up leading into the British Mandate, the League of Nations, which was the forerunner of the UN, the San Remo Conference. All of these things happened in the late 19-teens, early 1920s. And this was the foundation for the 1947 UN Partition Plan. This is the foundation for the idea that in modern legal times, that Israel had a legal right to the land. One thing that, there was a report that was a little bit disturbing to me. The Palestinian Authority said that they were going to sue England over the Balfour Declaration. And when we're talking about the ICC is a really serious court. I think it's fair game when you have a war and a number of civilians die for someone to make a report to the ICC, and the ICC decides hopefully fairly and objectively which way it's going to go. But there is a question that some people will say, especially having to do with the issue of the settlements. Should the ICC be spending time on this, or is are the Palestinians trying to use this as some sort of cudgel on Israel to force Israel to make concessions in the diplomatic arena? Suing England over the Balfour Declaration, this has more to do with public relations maybe than law. And really what we could look at it is, England issued promises recognizing Israeli rights to the land, which were then ratified by the League of Nations, basically a pre-UN. Similar things happened on the Arab side, and then hopefully both of the sides now, 100 years later, can work out a way, to share the land instead of having to try to delegitimize the others, basic rights to the land. So it has nothing to do with the International Criminal Court, but it's hard to sort of ignore when the 100th anniversary of the Balfour is tomorrow. I just wanted to throw that out there. And I'm happy to take questions about all of the various issues we just raised. Yes?
I have two questions. Very short questions. The first one is, you mentioned that only they can start the investigations as of 2012, right?
Sorry?
To start the investigations as of 2012?
That's the ICC has said that the earliest date that she has could have jurisdiction over Palestinian issues would be November 29, 2012, because that's when the UN General Assembly said they were a state of Palestine.
So anything before that cannot be investigated?
Not by the ICC. That's the position she has taken. I guess theoretically the Palestinians could, if she got to a point where she was bringing a case, the Palestinians could appeal that to the ICC pretrial chamber and see if they would order her to go backwards. I don't think that they would. I think that's the earliest date. I think really the most likely date is the Palestinian Authority itself submitted a declaration accepting the jurisdiction of the ICC and asking it to investigate as of June 2014. So that's really, I think, the date that we're looking at, is anything that's happened from June 2014 and forward in terms of settlements, wars, hopefully there won't be another war, but if there was another war, anything that happens from here, from that point on, would be, theoretically part of it.
Also, and what is exactly expected to come out in the report? Like, what is the major
The ICC?
thing? No, the report that you mentioned.
Oh, the comptroller's report?
Yes.
What's that about? Okay, so the state comptroller is supposed to be not a very exciting, very sexy organization, really. It's supposed to be sort of a bean counter. It evaluates all the different Israeli ministries. Are you efficient? Are you inefficient? Are you following sort of your protocols for the way you're supposed to work? Not very exciting, not very sexy. But they sometimes jump into bigger issues. They're sometimes sort of asked to take on issues that are, in debate within the Israeli public. There was a big debate after the 2014 Gaza war within the Israeli public. Should there be a state commission that, that's even an independent commission, an outside commission? After the 2000 Mavi Marmara flotilla incident, there was actually a sort of half outside commission that came in to investigate it. There were international observers involved. So some people said, we should have something like that. The government ended up not doing that. They thought that was, they said, we don't, every single time that something comes up, we don't have to have an outside commission. But the state comptroller's office is completely outside, the chain of command. Let's say, if you could say about the Israeli army's investigations, well, even the top lawyer in the Israeli army might have had, something to do with some of the, attacks during the war. So how can, he decide whether to investigate his own decisions. The Israeli army says, well, actually, we have things broken down into advisory sides of the Israeli army, and we separate that from the prosecuting. There's like a wall basically between the two, so we can do both. But some people say you can't. So the state comptroller definitely had nothing to do with the 2014 Gaza war. So they asked them, give us an evaluation of whether or not we complied with international law. And they got a bunch of, including international experts that aren't Israeli, and I think one who is Israeli, to work together to write this report, which is a long time coming. And I think everybody's waiting to see what they'll say and then react to that. Yes, in the back.
Can you say something about what happens after the ICC renders a decision? In other words, what powers of enforcement, if any, does it have?
So, I mean, it basically relies on the 125 countries that are members. There are 125 countries that are members, and all of them, if they've signed onto their own statute, are obligated, when it issues a warrant, they're obligated to arrest and extradite any of these, somebody who's a war criminal who travels in their country. So this is a very big deal. It's one of the reasons Israel, I can tell you, is, I wrote an article just a couple weeks about Palestine joining Interpol. And I sort of talked about that and the ICC at the same time. And I spoke to some Israeli government officials, and they said, we're in very, ongoing, constant, talks with the ICC. We can't say where things are going right now, but one of the reasons they're investing tons of energy in trying to work with the ICC is that most of Europe is part of those 125 countries. So theoretically, countries in Europe would have to decide, they have strong relations, or at least lots of business relations with Israel. They would have to suddenly decide, do we arrest top Israeli officials, top Israeli generals, Israeli soldiers who have become, civilian business people. That's not something that would be something that would make Israel very worried, both just in terms, not just in terms of traveling around the world, but in terms of legitimacy. And in terms of boycotts, so it could have a lot of negative reverberations. That's definitely a reason why Israel's, Israel's legal establishment wants to engage the ICC as much as it can. So it's now, can anybody force these countries to? No, we saw with South Africa. I pointed out the case that at the end of the day, if a member state ignores its obligations under international law, there isn't really somebody, to enforce that, unless, sometimes if it's a security issue, then you might have the United States or Russia, unofficially enforcing something. But there isn't really, the world still doesn't work that way. We're still a bunch of member states in all of these organizations, as opposed to there really being, some sort of federal system where you can force countries to comply with their treaty obligations. Yeah.
Was there ever a plebiscite on the British mandate?
Sorry?
Was there ever a plebiscite? Did the people actually in Palestine ever vote?
No.
No, so there was no vote among the people about what direction they should take the country. Okay, thank you.
With the Balfour Declaration.
From Balfour on, so other people made that decision for the people.
Correct. No, correct. And that's. Look, people criticize the British on a lot of different angles. They criticize the British for making promises to the Jews. They criticize the British for making promises to the Arabs. They criticize England and France for dividing up the Middle East in all sorts of ways that don't necessarily make sense with Syria and Iraq. And some people say that's why there are a lot of wars going on today, because they sort of divided things up in a way that made colonial sense for them. But I would say, right. I think if all Israel had was the Balfour Declaration by itself, that it's sort of the early point. What really gives Israel and the Palestinians both having rights over the land, in a more modern sense, is not just the League of Nations, but the UN Partition Plan of 1947, and of course, most importantly, UN Resolution 242, which says they both have to basically split the West Bank. It depends whether you look at the English translation or the French translation. The English translation says that Israel has to withdraw from territories in the West Bank. It doesn't specify the territories or all of the territories or which one. It's something that has to be negotiated. That's what Israel wanted. That's what the United States wanted. The French translation, I'm told, because I don't speak French, but I interviewed some experts that said that it does have the equivalent of the territories, which would mean a full withdrawal. And that's sort of, how did they get a ceasefire in 1967 was they had two different translations so that both sides could make, their alternate claims about what's supposed to happen in the West Bank. So you're right that I don't think anybody who would say that, the full legal rights could be decided by a document in 1917, that's not the point. The point is that, at least from the Israeli side, it's the first document that then rolls into some of these other documents which recognize both sides' rights.
Yeah, but once again, the people themselves didn't get a chance to register or vote. And that seems to me, in our day and age, that would be, looking back, maybe that wasn't possible. I don't know. But it seems that would be the natural way. Now, America has overturned that. We're in Vietnam. There was supposed to be a vote for North and South, and we skated on that and did an election on that. Yeah, okay, but the right thing to do is to have a vote of the people and let them decide themselves.
That's a hard. There aren't that many countries that have come into existence, just by, especially countries where two sides were fighting over it, where they have, held like a organized, civilized vote about how to split it. I'm not saying it hasn't happened, but I wouldn't say that that's maybe in an ideal world, but it's not. It doesn't usually happen that way. Yeah.
I have a question on 2 points. I disagree. If you find them long, I can say the other ones later. I think you glossed over the political weakness of ICC, because compared to ICJ has a lot of legitimacy, because in order to be in the UN, you have to accept ICJ's jurisdiction. In contrast to that, you don't have to accept ICC's jurisdiction. The ICC doesn't hold that. So, that person might give the impression that she doesn't care about politics. I don't really buy into that. From the point of view of ICC, I don't think they would ever want to enter a case where they can never win, because point blank, Israel didn't accept ICC's jurisdiction. That itself makes it impossible for ICC to enforce anything on Israel. So, but I wouldn't say that.
I can interrupt you for a second on that point. It's not exactly true. On a legal level, you're right that Israel could say, well, we're not members, so we can ignore you. If you look at Israel's record over the years, you want to say that Israel follows international law, that it doesn't follow international law. We could debate about that. Israel definitely wants to be seen as following international law. There are countries that could care less. I think, Russia most of the time could care less about whether it's seen as following international law. Israel definitely wants to be seen as following international law, and has sometimes bent over backwards and taken all sorts of actions. Again, the example of this Israeli soldier, the Hebron shooter, who's in jail right now, 80 to 90% of the Israeli public does not want this soldier in jail. Not that they think that what he did was right, they think that what he did was wrong, but they think that he was in a, hostile situation, and he was 19 years old, and he'd never been in a situation like that, and he made a mistake, and somebody was yelling bomb out in the air, and so he should have gotten a slap on the wrist or something, been thrown out of the army, but not put in jail or gotten a pardon, something like that. Despite that, the Israeli legal establishment, has sent him to jail. So I do think that even if officially Israel might not be obligated by the ICC, the way that Israel thinks about itself, I think absolutely would be very concerned about what the ICC might do. The one other thing I just want to say about the ICJ, you're right that countries are technically bound by ICJ advisory opinions, but when there's a one-to-one fight, countries can actually sort of opt out of jurisdiction with the ICJ also. So I think actually the ICJ's standing is very weak today, and really what I would say is the ICC hopes that it doesn't end up like the ICJ. The ICJ gets ignored all the time, unfortunately, or depending on your perspective. I think it's good for international courts to have more jurisdiction. I think whether they get it always right or always wrong, that if they don't get politicized, it can create a greater amount of fairness in the world. That would be a nice thing to happen.
Can I just clarify one thing? I'm not implying by not accepting ICC's jurisdiction, Israel isn't following international law, but I don't think it should be a concern on Israel's part. If I was Israel, that should.
It's a strategic concern. It's not a legal obligation.
I mean, you have on that list U.S., Turkey, Russia, China, India. 3 of 5 countries don't accept ICC jurisdiction.
Correct.
So it's not really a standard of following international law. I don't think people would focus too much on Israel for not doing that. I mean, it's whatever. But I think on ICC's, of course, if I was ICC, I wouldn't give that as a reason, because then you're announcing explicitly saying, as long as you don't, as long as you don't accept my jurisdiction, you can always evade me. I think they're still keeping the hope that in the future Israel is going to accept ICC jurisdiction. So I think they're just giving kind of false reasons for not pursuing.
Okay.
Just want to know what you know about.
Yes.
This may not be directly related to your topic, but I'd be curious to know your observations on things I've been reading recently about trends in Israeli government in terms of criticisms from people within Netanyahu's own party about his undemocratic actions or trends in terms of his criticisms or attacks on Supreme Court.
I'm going to suggest let's talk about that afterwards because it gets very esoteric into domestic Israeli politics. I don't know if everybody here is I'm happy to talk about it, but it definitely isn't related to this, and I don't know if everybody would follow. But I'm happy to talk about it afterwards. I'm not running out. Yes?
Yeah, just a brief observation in regard to the plebiscite. Turkey was the sovereign then, would hardly be likely to allow to vote on how to carve up its territory.
In the Balfour question.
Right.
What's it related to Turkey in any way?
Yeah, Turkey was in charge.
Turkey was founded in 1923.
Huh?
Turkey was founded in 1923.
Any questions from this side? Questions?
Just here?
Yes?
I have a point that I disagree. I don't think Israel's equivalent shouldn't be Hamas. Israel's equivalent is the Palestine that got into accepted by UN, the Palestine that ICC accepted, which isn't Hamas, which is Fatah, which is the Palestinian Authority. So I think it's a false equivalency to say that look, Hamas isn't investigating its own. I think Hamas's equivalent is the Jewish settlers who, like Hamas, operate outside of the internationally recognized sovereignty area. And I don't think Jewish settlers themselves investigate their actions too. So I think that's one false equivalency. That's one point I disagree on. And about Israel investigating itself, I think when Gujarat riot happened, the state of Gujarat investigated Narendra Modi. Narendra Modi was the governor. So there's, I think, a natural sense of unreliability when the suspect investigates itself, because it is still Israel's own army, Israel's own policemen. So Israel, another organ of Israel investigating won't be as reliable as.
So I didn't follow your first point, but on your second point, I think it is a absolutely sort of fair criticism to say, there are a range of how armies investigate themselves. Some of them actually have, not just separation between the prosecution and the advisory side, but that there isn't one person who's in charge of both. There's one person that's in charge of one and one person that's in charge of another, and they have completely, those two people don't interact. They're actually completely different roles. And so some people say, Israel should go in that direction also, and that would be a way to 100% ensure that there's no connection between the chain of command of, what's the advice of what's a legal target in the middle of the war and what's the advice of what to prosecute afterwards. What I'll say is that there's a wide diversity on that topic. There are a number of Western countries. There's a report done called the Turkel Report from 2013. A former Israeli Supreme Court judge and some other international observers did a full survey of Western countries of how they handle this. And there's a split. I think half of the countries that were evaluated do it Israel's way. They have one person at the top, and underneath him everybody is separated, but they have one person at the top. They say that he will have more authority actually to be able to prosecute because he's sort of like the Attorney General of the United States, is both the top prosecutor and the top advisor, and that gives him more weight if he has to push through something that might be an unpopular prosecution. And some people say, no, you need to have it completely separated even at the top. And that's, I think it's a fair criticism. I don't know, but I don't think you can say that, let's say Israel is the only country that does it because there are a number of other Western countries that have the same model. I do think that at the bare minimum, you do need to separate the prosecutorial apparatus and the advisory apparatus, and Israel does do that. Even if the person at the top runs both, under him, I can tell you that they do separate, the two. They're in different offices. They're not, part of the same chain of command. Other than the top, the top lawyer does run them both. Any last question?
One
clarification about your Bensouda interview. I'm curious whether she appreciated the point about opening up the can of worms on the settlement issue, that is, what taking on the West Bank settlements would then constitute a double standard if you don't also take on the other 5 cases. So this is the whole issue now with the UN having this blacklist of companies that operate in the West Bank. Well, why don't you have a blacklist of the Moroccan countries and the other countries?
I have the first article about that.
And so, right, so FIFA, actually, those people who like football, so FIFA just decided literally at their last meeting last week that they would not take on the Palestinian Football Association's claim against Israel's Football Association for fielding 6 teams in the West Bank. And the FIFA Council said, we're dropping this, do not bring it up again to us, we're not going to adjudicate this issue partly because there are lots of other places where lots of other countries field teams on disputed contested territory, and we're not going to start investigating and becoming a political outfit.
Right.
So I was wondering whether Bensouda also thought that this would politicize the ICC by taking on the settlement issue in a way that wouldn't happen with the war crime issue. It would be more in there.
Right. So one of the reasons I focused more on the war crime stuff is I think I have a better feel, and I think she has a better feel. Again, this is a guess, but my guesstimate is that she'll try to find some middle ground with the Israeli prosecution, recognizing some investigations as completely valid, and then with the ones that she's not happy with, instead of saying your whole system is, disaster, and we're going to come in saying, we suggest that you take, question so-and-so more, and we think so-and-so might have committed a war crime. Look into that more, and if you do, maybe we'll still stay out of things. With the settlements, I think nobody has any idea what she's going to do with it. It is that, it's absolutely, if she gets into that, it will change what the ICC is. It will be injecting the ICC very clearly, not just into sort of traditionally what was understood of the role of a war crimes tribunal, sort of having to do with what happens on the battlefield, but also into, basically the whole idea of where people are supposed to live and how they're supposed to live is supposed to be decided under UN Resolution 242 between the parties. So it really would be getting her into a very serious diplomatic area. Like I said before, I think if she thinks she needs to go there, I think she will. I think she is ready to, take all the diplomatic heat, if she believes that's the way to go. But I can't tell you that she'll necessarily go there, especially, again, when we're talking about the most that she would be going after, I think, is after June 2014. And there hasn't been a ton of new building after June 2014. Whether she could use that as a way to sort of like sneak in, take a look at just a very small slice of, new settlement, I'm only looking at these, 100 units or these 1,000 units, and I'm not looking at the other 400,000 people, and therefore say that she slid in there, but she's not really getting to the big issue. I don't know. I don't want to guess because I can't, when I spoke with them, even off the record, we were able to get deep into the specifics having to do with what happened in the battlefield, and with the settlements, I think. The jurisdictional issues of whether to get involved in it are so serious that they couldn't even. We really had nowhere to start. Yeah.
You indicated her term is a 9-year term.
Yeah.
Who decides who the next successor will be?
The Assembly of State Parties. It's sort of the ICC Congress. It's 125 members have an assembly, and they have an executive council and a president of the executive council. They're the ones who picked her, and her. She's the second ICC prosecutor. The founding prosecutor was Luis Moreno Ocampo. By the way, his suggestion about the settlements was to say that since the Israeli Supreme Court makes rulings about settlements and in certain instances has ordered settlements to be evacuated, that because of that, Israel could make the same claim that it tries to make regarding war crimes, that actually the Israeli courts have handled the issue and therefore the ICC can't get involved. I was the first one to report that. But I can tell you that there's no love lost between Bensouda and Ocampo. I don't think she'll do something just because he said so.
So very illuminating. I think everybody learned a lot. And this is just a little something from the Maxwell School.
Thank you.
For coming, and please join me in